Hi there, and welcome to Lesson 3. With this lesson, we are moving on from the second level of reading, which we call inspectional reading, and we are moving on to the third level of reading, analytical reading. This is the most important level of reading because this is where we take a deep dive into whatever text or book we're reading and really become demanding readers. Really get to know what that text is saying, what message it's communicating. And so this is the longest part of Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book, and so we'll be dividing it up over 2 lessons, which is why this is Analytical Reading Part 1. A little overview of what we'll cover in total in Lesson 3. So in this first part, we'll cover the chapters from How to Read a Book on Analytical Reading. There's 6 chapters in the book on analytical reading. Like I said, it is the most thorough part of how to read a book. So we're going to cover chapters 6 through 9 and save chapters 10 and 11 for lesson 4. And so those chapters are pigeonholing a book, which is figuring out in what genre the book belongs, X-raying a book, which is kind of that inspectional reading again, getting a good look at the book before we dive all the way in. Coming to terms with an author, so understanding how an author frames or sets up or qualifies their argument, and then determining an author's message, analyzing the book to figure out what the author is trying to say about its subject. So that'll be part 1. Part 2, we're going to cover a few different things. I asked you to read an article by an authoress named Christine Rowe on Agatha Christie, which I think will really help us understand more why we're studying Agatha Christie and Hercule Poirot in this class. And so I'm going to use that article to help with our analysis of the Christie story I asked you to read, Triangle at Rhodes. Rather than separating the article and the story up into 2 parts of the lecture like I did last time, I'm looking at them both in one part of the lecture. So the lecture overall will probably be a little bit shorter than last time for you. And also in part 2, we'll look a little bit at the writing prompt for your first major writing project, because that assignment will be due in a few weeks. And so the work I'm doing with Triangle at Rhodes, that Christine Rowe's article will help me with, is very similar to the type of work I'm going to ask you to do in that first writing project. So we'll look at those 3 things together in part 2 of the lecture. All right, so on to the third level of reading, analytical reading. And like I said, this is where we really take a deep dive into that text. We've been talking about becoming demanding readers. This is the part of the reading process where we reach that role, where we become demanding readers. So before we look at those specific chapters, a little bit of recall or review of what we've covered in the last few lectures. So if you recall, there are 4 levels of reading. Elementary reading is that basic level of literacy where you know how to read a book. In other words, you can understand the words on the page. Inspectional reading is the previewing or pre-reading, where we do kind of an analysis of some of the book or the text before we read it in its entirety to get an idea of what it's about. Then analytical reading, which we'll talk about today, is where we take that deep dive and we move from knowing how to read a book in the most basic way to knowing how to read a book in a very demanding way. And finally, syntopical reading. We're going to wait and cover syntopical reading in lessons 6 through 8 later in the quarter. That's where we put 2 texts or more, multiple texts or books into conversation. We find the connections between them. So these circles help symbolize skimming the surface, doing kind of an overview, going deeper, and then making connections. I said analytical reading is the most challenging and most important step. Syntopical reading is also very important because it helps us see how one book talks to another or what the connections are between different books, which is just so useful in so many ways. But step 3, or level 3, analytical reading is the most important, because that's what we do when we're actually reading the book. That's how we do the demanding reading. And then what we can do is do readings of multiple books at level 3, and in level 4, connect those demanding readings that we've done. So because this is the most thorough and complex level of reading, Mortimer Adler, the author of How to Read a Book, breaks it up into stages. So with the other 4 levels, you just have the level. But he then breaks analytical reading up into 3 stages, and each of those stages has 4 more rules. So a quick overview of those. You've got the 4 levels of reading, but then with analytical reading, you've got 3 stages. So stage 1 is finding what a book is about. Stage 2 is finding what a book says. And stage 3 is criticizing a book as a communication of knowledge. So to paraphrase a little bit here in my own words, to make this a little clearer, I think finding what a book is about and finding what a book says. I mean, that sounds pretty similar, right? Well, finding what a book is about is figuring out its subject matter or topic. So maybe you're reading a book on global warming. Maybe this is a for instance, maybe there's a specific issue within global warming, such as deforestation, and it takes you a little bit of inspectional reading to figure that out. That's step 1, or stage 1 here. Stage 2 is finding out what a book says. So that would be, okay, the book is about global warming and deforestation, for example. What does it say about those things? Are they good? Or are they bad? Etc. So you could say that stage 1 is figuring out the subject matter. Stage 2 is figuring out the thesis statement or main argument. Now, stage 3 is criticizing a book, and he calls it criticizing a book fairly. And that's what we'll cover in lesson 4. So we're going to cover 1 and 2 here in this particular lesson. But what's really interesting when we get to lesson 4 and we get to stage 3 here is that a big part of this class and a big part of the work you'll do as English students and in other fields beyond this class is assessing a text and giving a fair critique of it. And so you go from figuring out the subject matter of a book to figuring out its argument to giving a fair critique. And I think Adler has really helpful guidelines so that when we critique books, we do it fairly. And I look forward to talking about those guidelines with you in the next lecture. Finally, there's rules for each stage of analytical reading. So stages 1 and 2 each have 4 rules, which we'll go over today. And then stage 3 has more than that, and we'll go over those next time. Okay. So the first chapter here, and there's 2 chapters on each stage. So the first chapter on finding out what a book is about or finding out its subject matter is called pigeonholing a book. And here's the first rule he gives us. You must know what kind of book you are reading, and you should know this as early in the process as possible, preferably before you begin to read. So this can be that inspectional reading stage that we talked about in lesson 2. The title, other parts of the book should give you clues as to what it's about. And this classification, this pigeonholing, is genre. So different books belong to different genres. So in the fiction realm, you have mystery, action, comedy, science fiction. Those are some examples of genres. But there are levels of genres. So you have fiction and nonfiction. These are some genres within fiction. But fiction and nonfiction themselves are some genres. You might also have, or you do also have, more specific genres within the larger genre of nonfiction. You might have science or history or art or biography or something. And so Adler talks about signal flags, which are ways to identify the genre. And so you can look at the title, the table of contents, the chapter titles, the subheadings, the index. You can, if you're talking about a whole book, you can see the section in the store, where it's sold. If you're talking about an article, you might already know the genre because you might be searching for a specific type of article. So these are signal flags, and they help you do this, like pigeonhole the book, figure out its genre, and they can be done in the pre-reading or inspectional reading stage that we talked about last time. And it's good to know before you read a book what genre it belongs to. That's what he says. That's his first rule. But the question is why? Well, that second word I have in bold there is expectations. So if you're reading a certain book, you might have certain expectations going into that book. And those expectations are based on the genre. So for instance, if you're reading a mystery, like we are in this class, you might expect certain things. You might expect some different things and some similar things if you're reading an action adventure book. Comedy will probably have more differences, but maybe some of the same similarities depending on the type of comedy, because there are subgenres within these genres. And so, if you go to read a comedy and it ends up not being very funny at all, you'd be pretty disappointed. But if you go to read a mystery, while humor can be a part of it, that's probably not high on the list of expectations. Similarly, nonfiction genres will also have expectations, right? If you're reading a biography, you probably expect historical accuracy. And if you learn that the author made some things up instead of researching them, you might be pretty disappointed. So knowing a book's genre can help us know what criteria we should use to evaluate it. And it's good to know those things before we go into it. The author might be doing things a certain way to reach a certain audience. For instance, young adult fantasy romance novels, like the Twilight books, are going to have a very different audience than probably the expected audience of legal thrillers by Michael Connelly and John Grisham. And so who is in those audiences will help determine how the author writes their book. And if we want to do a proper analysis, we need to know who the audience is, what the genre is, and what the expectations are based on audience and genre. So that's why we have to pigeonhole a book. Now, that term pigeonholing is a little bit misleading in the sense that there can certainly be overlap between genres, like action comedy, or a mystery that takes place in outer space, or a nonfiction book that is covers art, history, and biography because it's about a certain painter's life who was very influential politically or something like that. So there can certainly be overlap, but still knowing these things is good going in because it helps us know what to expect. Finally, he talks about the difference between practical versus theoretical books. And so, some books are just give you theoretical knowledge. You learn about a subject. And other books give you practical knowledge, like how-to books, how to do something. And there's a lot of debate over this, which is better, which is more useful. But I really like how Adler brings these two together because he says intelligent action depends on knowledge. So in other words, you have to have some knowledge to be able to do things. So most books, most good books, he says, are both practical and theoretical. And a book might be labeled as theoretical but be very practical and vice versa. And so this just really shows the overlap of genres I was talking about a minute ago. So before we go too deep into a book, we need to know a book. We need to know its genre and know what to expect, but we have to keep in mind it might be overlapping multiple genres and there might be, multiple sets of expectations then. Okay, so that was Chapter 6, pigeonholing a book or identifying its genre, and that's the first rule of Stage 1. Now we're going to look at Chapter 7, which is X-raying a book, and this will have the next 3 rules for Stage 1. Remember, Stage 1 is identifying the subject matter of a book. Now, X-raying a book, what that title means is, the X-ray is a good metaphor. So what it means is really just another version of inspectional reading. Once we know the genre, then we can kind of X-ray a book. We can look at its contents, its structure, before reading the whole book in its entirety. So Rule 2 is state the unity of the whole book in a single sentence or at most a few sentences, a short paragraph. So this is, taking a book apart and what it's, what it's about. And so you can do this like as pre-reading, like I said, by looking at the title, the chapter titles, the table of contents, the index, etc., and probably get a pretty good sense of what it's about. But you can also do this after you read too. So X-raying a book can be part of inspectional pre-reading, but it doesn't have to be pre-reading. I should clarify that. So you can also do this afterwards. This is a great exercise to do afterwards. I really like what he says here. State the unity of the whole book in a single sentence. That can be hard to do, right? Especially if you're reading a longer book, like 300 or 400 pages. So why is this useful? Well, it helps you really clearly pin down what the book is about. It helps you become a demanding reader. You have to take a step back and take an assessment and say, this is what this book is about, succinctly, briefly. And he says, you ask someone, what are they up to? What are they about? Like, what are you doing today? Well, all authors are up to something. They have a purpose when they write. So this helps you really pinpoint, identify the purpose. If it's a long, complex, nebulous book, writing about it in a short sentence just helps you really narrow and clarify your focus as you're interpreting it. Rule 3, set forth the major parts of the book and show how these are organized into a whole. So once you've got that sentence or a few sentences that say, this is what this book is about, then you kind of go through and you look at the different parts. So maybe the chapters, maybe the subheadings within chapters, and see what is the structure? How is it organized? So this is very much like, again, like inspectional reading from last time, where you get a sense of the main thing, what it's about, and then you look at the parts to see how that thing is put together. And so why do this? If you write one sentence saying what it's about and then 3 or 4 sentences summarizing the different parts, why not just do this all as one step or one rule? And he has a great point here. I really like this point. I think it's so true and so helpful. He says, it is easier to grasp a complex and unified structure in 2 steps instead of 1. So if I say, tell me what this book is about in 5 sentences, 5 sentences is more than you need to just give me the main subject. It's enough to give me the subject and the structure. But if I say, tell me the main subject of the book, and then in a few more sentences tell me the structure, just the way the human mind works, it's easier to do it that way. And so this is an important distinction in that when you're outlining what a book is about, you need to take it in a couple steps, not try to do it in one shot. And you'll understand the book better, and your mind will work more fluidly. Finally, define the problems the author is trying to solve. So this is really important. This rule relates back to the first one. What is the book about, and what is an author up to? So if they have a purpose, usually they're trying to solve some kind of problem. It might be, if you're reading a fiction book, it might be merely that they want to sell books and make money. Or it might be they want to write a certain story with a certain theme, a certain idea they want to convey, or they want something to happen to that character, right? For instance, when Agatha Christie wrote the last Hercule Poirot novel, it's called Curtain. And so the problem she was trying to solve was, how do I give Hercule Poirot, who I've written, 20-some books and 30-some short stories about, how do I give him a proper ending? And she did a very good job, but that'd be the problem she's trying to solve. And in a nonfiction book, you might have all kinds of problems. What do we do about global warming? The problems might be a little more obvious in a nonfiction book, but an author is always trying to do something. And so we can say, what is an author's purpose? But that's not always easy to answer. So if we attack that question from another angle, come at it from a different angle and say, instead of just saying, what are they trying to do, say, what problem are they trying to solve? That qualifies the question a bit more, and it might be easier to figure out their purpose if we ask it that way. So some helpful strategies for you here. So let's sum up stage 1, which is, what is the book about, or what is its subject matter? Here's what we just covered. And these are the rules. Identify the genre, summarize the book in 1 or a few short sentences, outline the parts of the book, and define the problems the author is trying to solve. So those are kind of my paraphrase. Instead of pigeonholing, I say identify the genre. I think it's just a little bit quicker and easier to remember. So definitely take a minute and take note of these, and then we'll move on to stage 2. You can always pause the lectures if you need to. So chapter 8 then gives us the first stage of figuring out what a book is saying or what argument it's making. And that first stage is coming to terms with an author. And this is one of my favorite chapters in how to read a book, because I think it conveys an idea that's just really important and very often overlooked. A lot of what you're reading and how to read a book should be useful and helpful to you. That's my goal in assigning it. But some of the ideas you may already know or may already be familiar with. In my years teaching this is one that I found I think is pretty often overlooked. And so I'm happy to discuss it with you now because I think it's very important. So this is what Adler has to say about this idea of coming to terms with an author. If the author uses a word in one meaning and the reader reads it in another meaning, words have passed between them, but they have not come to terms. Where there's unresolved ambiguity in communication, there is no communication, or best, communication must be incomplete. I love how he says that. So you might think of it kind of like signing a contract. Like, for example, earlier this year I bought a house. And so when I purchased the house, the seller, I was the buyer, then there was a seller. We had to agree on certain things, right? Like there were certain things the seller had to fix in the house. The outlets upstairs weren't grounded, so they had to ground the electricity up there before I would buy the house and agree to do it. And so we had to come to those terms in order for the purchase to happen. So similarly, when you read a book, the same thing happens. You're engaging with an author. You're entering into a contract, into that author-audience relationship. And just like buying a house or a car or signing a contract, leasing an apartment, there are terms. And you might be wondering, well, how does this come up with reading a book? Well, it comes up because of what Adler says in the first couple clauses here, that the English language is fluid and slippery, and we may not define all words or terms the same way. So you might be using a word one way, and the author might be using it a different way. And if you don't get on the same page as the author, you won't understand what they're trying to say. The same is true when you write something and you have readers, and that's why later in the quarter when you write your own papers, I'll explain how it's very important to define your terms, usually in the second paragraph after the intro, before you get too far in the paper. So he talks about the difference between terms and words, because a word can be any word, but a term is a word that's used unambiguously. Words are ambiguous because they have multiple meanings. In one discipline, a word might mean one thing. In another discipline, it might mean something else. So if you're reading a book in a certain genre, you need to know, how that genre uses those words. And so when it goes from being a word to a term, it means you've come to terms with the author. You've pinned down, you said, this, in this context, this is this one definition of this word. And those other definitions are saved for other contexts, other genres. So again, you see how classifying a book is important, because classifying a book can help you understand, come to terms with the author. And so rule 5 then is find the important words and through them come to terms with the author. So this is similar to what we talked about last time in lesson 2 with reading something and highlighting the key words, looking for words that are repeated multiple times or seem to connect to the author's main argument, determining which words are important. So we talked about that. You highlight them, look up the definitions, and here again, look up the definitions in the specific context. A word used in biology might be used different in history. And so know that specific context, figure it out, and come to terms. I think there's a really good example in Agatha Christie, because she was writing in the 1920s and 1930s. Most of the stories we're reading, and certain words meant different things back then because the English language compared to other languages is very fluid. So, some of the stories I've been reading to prepare for class, I've encountered words like queer, which just meant strange back then, and now has kind of a different meaning. Or the word gay, which meant happy, and has a very different meaning now. Um, so you've got to come to terms with the author if you're going to be able to truly interpret a book and eventually criticize it fairly. Okay, finally, the last chapter from this reading, chapter 9, is determining an author's message. So we've gone over how to figure out the subject matter of a book by looking at its genre and kind of summarizing it and outlining it so we know what it's about. But what is it saying about that subject? What stance does it take? You might think of your own writing. If you write a paper about global warming and you say, this is a paper about global warming, or in this paper I discuss such and such, that's not a stance. That's not an argument. So that would still be stage 1. Stage 2 is where you take that stance. So, moving from this paper is about global warming and its effects to global warming has a number of negative effects, and this is what we should do about it, fill in the blank. That's the difference between a subject matter and a message. And so this is the most important chapter from the chapters we've read today, because this is where we learn Adler strategies for how to identify the author's message. So Rule 6 is grasp the author's leading propositions by dealing with the most important sentences. So by proposition, he means like little arguments. There'll be a main argument, maybe like global warming is bad. So that's really simple, but I'm just trying to illustrate a point. And it's not necessarily a statement I agree with. It's just an example. But global warming is bad because, and you fill in the blank with 3 or 4 reasons. Those reasons would be propositions or kind of sub-arguments that will, when you prove those arguments, will in turn support your main argument. So identify the author's leading propositions. What are his subpoints he's using to support his stance? How do you find those? By finding the most important sentences. So kind of like reading for keywords or key terms, read for key sentences. So, after you read or as you read, highlight. This seems important. This seems important. And when you finish a chapter or a section, go back and reread the sentences you've highlighted. If the author's propositions and even their thesis it was not clear before highlighting and rereading the most important sentences, it will be by then. So you can kind of construct the author's argument. You can move backwards. You can go from sentences to propositions to main argument to figure out the author's message. So if you read a book in its entirety, you may still not know the message, and you've got to dig back in, look at what you've highlighted, look at your notes in the margins to figure out the message. And working backwards is going from small to large is a way to do that, from sentences to subtopics to main topic. And Rule 7 is basically what I just said. Like, there'll be 2 types of arguments: explicit, which is always nice because then the author just says, hey, this is my argument, which is kind of nice. It makes our job easier. But then there's implicit arguments where the author doesn't come out and say it directly. And so you have to look at the sentences, figure out the sub-arguments, from there figure out the main arguments, and like he says here, construct. I think that's a really good metaphor. Through your own analysis, going from small to large, construct the author's message. And even if an article or a book, and articles are usually pretty explicit, even if the argument is explicit, there might be other propositions or other kind of ideas they allude to, they don't say directly, or just implications of their argument. And it's good to suss these out and figure out what they are. So this activity of kind of working backward and constructing an author's argument is super helpful to just understanding the book or the thing you're reading better. And so I would recommend practicing this, practicing it on, something you read. Finally, determine which of the problems the author has solved. And so they might solve more than one, but not all of them. So knowing which they've solved, which they failed to solve, and if they've identified which they failed to solve can be really helpful. It can kind of point you to where to go next, what to read next, where to look for connections when you eventually get to syntopical reading. So this final sentence is just my way of paraphrasing or summing up what we just discussed, summing up the method of constructing an author's message by working backwards. So To find the meaning, we move from keywords to important sentences to main arguments. So an overview here to just sum up before we move on. Stage 1 is, what is the subject of a text? So I'm going to divide this into 2 stages because that's how Adler does it, but I'm paraphrasing in my own words the difference between stage 1 and stage 2. So stage 1 is the subject matter. Stage 2 is the meaning or the message. So what would be an example? Well, in the last lesson, we read Agatha Christie's The Dream, so I'll use that as my example. So if I wanted to tell someone in one sentence what is the subject matter of Agatha Christie's The Dream, or what Agatha Christie's The Dream is about, this is what I'd say. Agatha Christie's The Dream is about the death of an eccentric millionaire who may or may not have committed suicide. So it doesn't tell me the meaning or the message or the argument, but it does tell me what the story is about in just one sentence. Okay, so stage 2 is, what does the text have to say about that subject? What stance does it take? So the millionaire is actually murdered by his secretary who plotted with his wife. So this story reveals that we can be betrayed by anyone, even those closest to us. So that's a theme or an idea. It's not just a subject, it's telling us a little more. It's a proposition. The millionaire did not trust his daughter's choice of husband, but she did not betray him. So who we choose to place our trust in is very important. That's a message the story conveys at the end, because we can tell that the daughter is of good character. And his wife was much younger than him. We get the impression that this guy was not a very good guy because of how he treated his daughter's fiance. And so we see he put his trust in the wrong places because those people he did trust betrayed him. And the person that he betrayed, the person to whom he was unkind, still maintained trust, did not betray him. And she's rewarded at the end of the story with her father's inheritance and the freedom to marry whom she wants. And so the story is making a point about moral character and where we should place our trust. You know, the millionaire married a woman half his age, and so he was probably lost or something that he placed his trust in instead of the moral fiber, the moral character of his daughter. And so there's an important message in the story. But the subject matter is just what it's about. So there's 2 distinctions, 2 levels here. And so with stage 1, we'd say this is what it's about. Stage 2, we'd say this is the moral or the meaning or the message. Stage 3, which we'll talk about in lesson 4, would say, is this fair? So we could then go on and critique the story and say, is this a good lesson? Did it do a good job of conveying it? And that's the third and final stage we'll get to next time.